So hello, everyone. It is so good that you're here on this Saturday. We are so excited for what we're going to talk about because this is a topic that, as you know, is gripping everyone. I know it feels a little bit weird considering what's going on in the world right now. But this is another one of those issues that we in churches have been talking about. But it is really crazy for me to see how many people are represented from how many places, different states, and even potentially different countries. And so my name is Fiel Sahir. I am a director of partnerships right here at City Mission, and welcome to Building Blocks. As you know, or most of you know, that many immigrant neighborhoods like Elmhurst, Queens, where we are based, are unaware of their possibility to bring the change that they want to see. And so we just give up. We lack an empowering just feeling, like we just don't feel like anyone cares about us and there's no loving community. And so when people are not empowered, many feel like there's simply nothing to be done, or there's too high of a mountain to climb, whether it be the system or whatever case is. So as you know, in New York City, everything tends to happen in Manhattan. And so amazing people like Lester have said, no, not everything's going to happen in Manhattan. We're going to have things happening in Queens. And so that's where we come in. We provide learning experiences, tools, and the community to actually actualize potential to make you become a local change maker where you are. And so City Mission is a nonprofit in Elmhurst working to create thriving neighborhoods by working with youth, immigrants, and those experiencing homelessness, of which there are many. So what you're at right now is Building Blocks, which is our teaching arm. And this is where we bring in people to talk, doing amazing things, to talk about topics that speak to their hearts and where their life mission is. So we've had people from NYC Relief speak on combating homelessness. We've had people speak on human trafficking, like with Chandra Wawuruntu. And yeah, this was before Corona. So I just want to give you a quick update on what's been going on with City Mission and other things. As you may have seen, there was an article a few weeks ago talking about how in Elmhurst, the St. Bart's Roman Catholic Church had a line of 1,000 people waiting for food, and they were lining up at 2 or 3 in the morning. And this is real, right? Elmhurst is one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the world, and we have a hotbed of what it means to live a tough life. But good news is we have hope. So we have wonderful sisters and brothers in Christ who actually are here today on this call as well, leading throughout our neighborhood and doing amazing work. Just yesterday, the City Mission team was at Stacy's Pantry with Pastor Joe Montavani of St. Jacobus Lutheran Church, and we celebrated the bagging and feeding of 3,500 families since Corona started. And that's just one pantry of many. There are others that are doing things through New Life Fellowship and Flora Ministries and Mantari, working with the various people in our neighborhoods, because it is crazy. People were lined up, some of them since 1 a.m. for an opening at like 9:30 to 10. That's insanity. So people are desperate. So this has been an amazing, incredible time where people have been stepping up and making a difference where they are. So let's just give them a quick round of applause wherever you are. Thank you so much for what you do. And so now we have our special guest that is going to take the show on. This is Greg Coles, man beyond his years, and one that is constantly seeking to spread the gospel of Jesus and the hope that we have in him in so confusing times. And so Greg Coles is PhD, Penn State University, is the author of Single Gay Christian, A Personal Journey of Faith and Sexual Identity. And he currently lives in central Pennsylvania, where he works as a writer, speaker, and worship leader. Yes, he plays music, and very well, I hear. And his forthcoming second book is called No Longer Strangers, Finding Belonging in a World of Alienation. Unfortunately, that comes out next year. So be on the lookout on Amazon, thrift books, wherever you buy books. So take it away, Greg.
Thanks, Biel. Thanks, folks, for joining us this afternoon. Also, I want to say, Craig, happy birthday. I wanted to talk today. The title that I gave Fiel way back when for this conversation was Keeping the Good News Good for LGBTQ People. And in the last couple weeks, especially as conversations about race have become so sort of prevalent again in society, I've just been struck by the fact that the idea of keeping the good news good extends way beyond this one conversation about sexuality. And I think it's an important lens for us to bring as we think about justice for folks like Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and so many others before them, right? As we look at the really the really bad place that the United States is in some ways with regard to issues of systemic racism, we have to ask the question, what does it look like for the good news to actually be good in this situation? Not just to be a nice casual pat on the back, yeah, you'll be okay, move along, but to really address the problems that need to be addressed. Because, and this is something that I've been wrestling with in my own heart as I look at what does it look like for me as a white person to come to grips with the ways that I'm part of the problem? What does it look like for me to shut up and listen? What does it look like for me to be a support, to be somebody who embodies Jesus to my brothers and sisters of color? Because a conviction that I hold is the idea that if the good news is not good news for people of color, it's not good news at all. And you could put so many different things into that phrase, right? If the good news is not good news for people with disabilities, it's not good news at all. If the good news is not good news for people of all socioeconomic statuses and all races, for people who have all different kinds of experiences of sexuality, it's not good news at all. So in saying that, I don't mean to try to equate race and sexuality in any way, to say, oh yes, these are totally the same conversations, because they're not. But I
Thank you so much, everybody, for your patience.
Yes, indeed. Yes, do forgive me for that interesting interruption. But I'm glad that Fiel could keep you entertained. Fiel called me. He was like, "What's going on?" I was like, "I don't know. I'm restarting my computer. Tell a joke." So hopefully he kept you well entertained in the meantime. Where were we? We were talking about the gospel needing to be good news for all of us, but to meet each of us in our own specific needs. And I was struck. Fiel, for instance, brought up the fact that one of the things that City Mission does is work on issues of homelessness. And some of you may know that according to some recent statistics, 40% of the homeless youth in the United States are LGBTQ homeless youth. So that's compared to estimates of somewhere between 3 and 10% of the population being LGBTQ people. So this is a disproportionate number of people for whom there are really concrete material needs like homelessness, like bullying in schools, and in the midst of the current polarization, it can be really hard to know what does it look like to keep the good news good for this specific group of people in the context of continuing to recognize what the Bible has to say about sexuality and about what it looks like for followers of Jesus to steward their sexuality. As you might imagine, this context and the world that we live in is kind of a weird context in which to write a book called Single Gay Christian, which is the book that I wrote, and it's a book about living in the tension between a few things that tend to make some different groups very uncomfortable. One of those things is that I am gay, by which I mean that since I was a kid and persistently over the course of my life, I've been exclusively attracted just to the same sex and not to the opposite sex. And even though there was a season of time where I tried really hard to pray, to pray myself straight, basically, to become the thing that I thought I needed to be in order to follow Jesus, I didn't find that happening. And yet, the other thing that I was praying for at the same time, praying that maybe if God was going to let me stay gay, that he would also cause me to come to a conviction that said that I could, as a follower of Jesus, pursue a same-sex sexual relationship with somebody of the same gender. I didn't find the Bible leaving space for that. And I don't plan to talk today a whole ton about how I came to the conclusions that I reached on the question of sexual ethics, though I'm happy to talk with you more about it in Q&A if that's something that you want to talk about. But in short, my findings when I went to study the Bible for myself I found to my surprise that there was no biblical promise that I would become straight. There was no part of the Bible that said, "Then shalt thou experience only the sexual desire for the opposite sex and never for the same sex." I was so ready for it to be in there, like in the book of Second Hesitation somewhere, but it wasn't. But what the Bible also didn't say was that I was promised marriage, that I was promised sex, that I was promised children. It seemed to say that I was promised Jesus, and that might turn out to be a really costly invitation. So when I share my own testimony with folks, my story of landing in this current place of saying I'm gay, and yet I think for me, since I'm not attracted to the opposite sex, I think what that means for me is that I'm called to be celibate. As I shared that story with people, one thing that I would sometimes wrestle with is the question of what does my story have to do with other people's stories? How is the gospel in my life similar to the gospel in other people's lives? And what I started to do is, if I would be in a place where the thing I was doing predominantly was just sharing my testimony. Here's my story of sexuality. Here's my story of meeting Jesus. Here's why I came to the conclusions that I came to, and have chosen to be celibate. What I would often do to those crowds is I would say, I'm going to tell this story, but I'm going to include along the way some moments that I will call straight people applications. And so I would tell them, if you're sitting there and you're wondering, what does this have to do with me? I would tell them, don't worry, because your straight people applications are coming. And the straight people applications were always, it was sort of a joke. It was facetious, a bit tongue-in-cheek, because the thing that I wanted to suggest ultimately was that, in fact, the gospel turns out to be remarkably the same good news for all of us, that there's really no such thing in the end as straight people applications and gay people applications, that we don't need to cordon off the gospel for different groups of people, but that in fact the gospel invites us all into the same story, because in the end we're all wrestling with the same fundamental questions of, is Jesus really who he says he is? If so, what is it going to cost me to follow him? What would I need to give up to follow him? And if I give those things up, is it going to be worth it? And so the thing that I want us to sort of grapple with together today is the question of whether it's possible that maybe having a good conversation with LGBTQ people about the gospel and about what it looks like to follow Jesus, even if that means something really costly for them, like celibacy, that having that conversation is actually a gift to the gospel more broadly. I think it's easy for a lot of us to approach the LGBTQ conversation with trepidation, as if it's something that is a threat to the advance of the kingdom of God. And we sort of wish, wouldn't it be so much easier if everyone were just nicely straight and we didn't have to talk about sexuality at all? Wouldn't the gospel make so much more sense? Wouldn't that be a better thing for the kingdom of God? But I want to propose to you today that in reality, the need to have this conversation is kind of a gift for all of us as we wrestle with the gospel, because it forces us to think better about what the gospel means for all of us, both in our sexuality, whether we're straight or gay or anything else, and also in other realms of our life. About a year ago, I was talking with a college student named Melissa, and she was coming back to church after a long time having been away from faith. And she wanted to talk with me about sexual ethics. That as she entered back into our faith community, she said, well, I am sort of excited about Jesus, but I have these concerns because of all the LGBTQ friends I have, because of where I am in my own experience of sexuality. And so she said, I want to sit down with you. I want to talk to you about sexual ethics. I want to know what our church says. I want to know what you believe the Bible says. And based on that, I want to make a decision about whether or not I want to come back to church at all, whether or not I want to come back to this church community. So she said, tell me what the Bible says. Is it okay to be gay? Yes or no? Discuss. And it was very tempting for me in that moment to want to sort of launch right into the conversation that she seemed to be inviting me to have, right? To say, okay, let's break out the Septuagint Greek. Let's look at the relevant Bible passages that seem to discuss sexual ethics. Is it okay to enter into a same-sex relationship? Yes or no? It was tempting for me to sort of go right into that conversation with her. But I took a moment and I asked Jesus, is that where you want this conversation to go right now? And he said, no. That's not the conversation she needs to have. She just needs to talk about who I am. And so I said, Melissa, talk to me about who you believe Jesus is. And as we began to talk about her understanding of Jesus, of what it meant to follow Jesus, I began to realize that it turned out that she wasn't convinced that Jesus was really God. She wasn't convinced that Jesus was really trustworthy. And so if it turned out that Jesus might say something to her or to her friends about sexuality that she didn't like, it was still a toss-up for her whether in the end she would want to go with Jesus or she would want to go to the place that her sexuality was tugging her. And so I realized if we're ever going to have any kind of productive conversation about sexuality, we can only do it if we first come at it from a place of being on the same page about who Jesus is. And as I was having that conversation with Melissa, it struck me, I think I'm surrounded by a lot of other people in my church spaces who blend in better than Melissa does because they don't have the same proximity to the LGBTQ community that Melissa does. They blend in just fine. And yet, like Melissa, they're also not really convinced that Jesus is trustworthy. They're not really convinced that he needs to be the Lord of their lives, no matter what things he might call them to, no matter how crazy it might seem, no matter how much it might seem to pull them away from the things that they feel like they most need in order to be happy. And I began to wonder if these are people who can seem to get along living Christianly, without ever being forced to face the question of whether they're actually willing to give up anything at all for Jesus, then is it possible that these are people who are missing an occasion to encounter the real Jesus? And is it possible that maybe for Melissa and for others like her, maybe there's a gift in having this part of her life that forces her to ask up front, do I really trust Jesus? So that when she comes to the conviction, to the place of saying either, yes, I absolutely do, even though it doesn't make sense in these components of my life, I am willing to give up anything, that maybe Melissa is actually able to encounter Jesus in a way that so many others around her are missing. There's a fantastic moment in Robert Gundry's commentary on the book of Matthew. He's talking about the moment in Matthew where Jesus encounters the rich young ruler. And Gundry is discussing how some readers, and he's talking specifically in the context of Western and relatively wealthy on the spectrum of the global and historic church, Western Christians reading this passage and saying, oh, yes, Jesus called the rich young ruler to give up his wealth, but that's okay. Jesus is not calling me to give up my wealth. And Gundry says that Jesus did not command all his followers to sell all their possessions, gives comfort only to the kind of people to whom he would issue that command. Let me read that again. That Jesus did not command all his followers to sell all their possessions, gives comfort only to the kind of people to whom he would issue that command. In other words, Jesus is remarkably good at identifying the things in each of our lives that we might say, oh, surely Jesus wouldn't call me to that. Oh, surely Jesus wouldn't call me to live below a certain socioeconomic means. Oh, surely, no matter what Jesus might say about sexuality, surely he wouldn't tell me that I have to be celibate for my entire life. Oh, surely, any moment that we look at our lives and say, surely Jesus is not allowed to call me to that thing, that might be the very thing that Jesus wants to call us to, not because Jesus is vindictive, not because Jesus doesn't want what's best for us, but because Jesus wants followers who are so totally convinced that following him is everything, that he's kind enough to ask us to be obedient, even in the very places that we're most convinced he couldn't possibly give us anything better than what we think we can get from the world. So when I think about interactions about sexuality, not just on questions of LGBTQ sexuality, but also in my interactions with straight brothers and sisters, I often wonder if our very reluctance at the thought of possibly being called to give up sex for the sake of the gospel, if our very reluctance is maybe the evidence that we do need to consider it more seriously. And again, I'm not just saying we need to consider it more seriously in the case of LGBTQ people. When I read 1 Corinthians 7, when I read Paul's incredible enthusiasm for the idea of celibacy, and then I talk to so many straight Christians who seem to say, oh yeah, of course Jesus is calling everyone to marriage. And celibacy is a very rare thing. And yet Paul seems to say, no, I wish that more of you were as I am. In other words, I wish that more of you were experiencing the call to celibacy. I think all of us maybe need to be invited back into that question of seriously reconsidering, are we maybe called to give up more in the realm of our sexuality than we dared to expect? I think the most productive question that any of us can ask as we're discerning how to steward our sexuality, again, whether we're LGBTQ, whether we're straight, the question is, how much do you trust Jesus? And how much do you believe that he has the right to call you to anything? Again, it's those fundamental gospel questions. Is Jesus who he says he is? What would I need to give up to follow him? And would it be worth it? I think often when we talk to people about the gospel, we can be guilty of getting things out of order because we focus on the second question or the third question before we've answered the first question, right? If we start with question 2, what do I need to give up? Then we can end up in a faith that's all about legalism. It's all about what we have to do to earn God. It's all about trying to be good enough to please God. My faith is all giving up. And if we start with question 3, is it going to be worth it? We can end up with a sort of a selfish prosperity style gospel. Oh, it's all about what God does for me. Faith is entirely defined by the good gifts that God lavishes on me. But I think we're not prepared to answer any of those questions until we first landed on the truth about question 1. Is Jesus really who he says he is? Because if he is, then it just naturally follows that there are certain ways that we need to live in obedience to him. And if he really is who he says he is, then it also naturally follows that the things that we find in obedience to him are going to be so worth it because he's promised us that they will be worth it. And I also think, in addition to taking our time, getting to question 2, getting to the question of what Jesus does call us to give up in stewarding our sexualities, I think it's also important for us when we're in a relationship of discipling someone, it's important for us to not try to set the agenda about which areas of a person's life God wants to tackle first. because for so many of us, sexuality is a component of our lives, and yet that doesn't mean that it is the whole of our lives. And God, I hope that you know that God is gracious in dealing with each one of us, and that He moves us along in His time and not in the times that someone else tries to impose. If we're in a support role with someone else and we're helping them encounter Jesus, it's important that our role be primarily about pointing them to the Jesus who is good and saying, you need to get your answers from that Jesus about what He's calling you to, about why it's going to be worth it. That we exist in other people's lives to facilitate their genuine encounters with Jesus, not to try to serve as a sort of Jesus substitute in their lives. So I want to touch just briefly, and then my hope is that we can unpack this a lot more in our time of conversation together. But I want to touch just briefly on a couple ways that I think these three questions: is Jesus who He says He is? What would it cost me to follow Him? And is it going to be worth it? I want to touch briefly on the ways that I think those three questions often come up as we're having conversation with people who identify as LGBTQ or as same-sex attracted and are seeking to follow Jesus, or are interested in following Jesus, or just want to know what Jesus is all about. And by the way, for those of you who noticed that I said LGBTQ and same-sex attracted, there are some conversations also about terminology that we can have if you want. I'm not jonesing to have them if you're not interested, but in short, people have different comfort levels around those two terms. And so some people will use them interchangeably. Some people strongly prefer one or the other, but I'll kind of use them both here. So these three questions, how do these show up when we're talking with folks who are LGBTQ or same-sex attracted? Under the question of, is Jesus who He says He is? Certainly part of this question is just the bare historical question. Hey, is Jesus really this first century guy who showed up, performed miracles? Did He really die? Did He really rise again? And as I said before, in the case of Melissa, it's silly for us to try to get beyond that question until we've dealt well with that question. Because everything else comes out of that, right? As Paul says in 1 Corinthians, if Christ is not raised, our teaching is useless, and so is your faith. So everything that we pursue in faith only makes sense if it comes out of a place of having first answered that question. But as we wrestle with who Jesus says He is, I think we also need to ask the question about the holiness of Jesus. Is Jesus really someone who, in addition to loving us, also wants our obedience? I think there can be a contemporary thrust of a description of God that sort of makes Him sound fuzzy and harmless, like God is just a thing meant to make everyone feel sort of therapeutically happy. And if that's our conception of who Jesus is, then of course it will never make sense that Jesus might call us to anything costly. But there's also an opposite error that thinks of God as this angry and fear-mongering thing. And for many of us, but I think especially sometimes for LGBTQ people, we're likely to associate these two extreme visions of God with the two extreme visions we're aware of in the sexuality conversation. So there's an extreme version of God that says God is all love, all warm fuzzies, and therefore surely God will endorse anything I want for my life. Or on the other hand, God is an angry being and God hates me because I am gay. God is disgusted by me. And if the only conceptions that we have of God are God as He lives in one of those two poles, then we'll never really be equipped to approach God honestly and to hear from Him what sexual stewardship might look like in the lives of those of us who are LGBTQ or who are attracted to the same sex. So underneath question 2, what will I need to give up to follow Jesus? I think there are a few components we want to pay attention to here, which I'll call for now ethics questions, vocational questions, and corrective questions. So the ethics questions are the sort of bare questions about what are the rules of sex with relation to this conversation. Of course, there are lots of other ethics questions in the world too. There are lots of other ways in which following Jesus is costly. But specific to this conversation about sexuality and LGBTQ identity, these ethics questions are, what does the Bible have to say about what it means to steward my body in a way that honors God? What does it say about same-sex sexual relationships? Does it matter whether those relationships are within a committed monogamous covenant or not? What does it say about marriage? How does the Bible define marriage? What constitutes a marriage? And even once we get there, is all sex within the context of marriage in bounds, or are there certain other rules that apply? These are questions that we do need to address at some point as we wrestle with the question of what does it mean to follow Jesus? But we can't just answer those questions. We can't just spend our entire lives saying no. Certainly, if a person is someone like me who would say, I am gay, and yet when it comes to the ethics of sex, I believe that God is calling me to say no to the kind of sex that I feel sort of naturally predisposed to desire. I can't just spend my life saying no. As one celibate lesbian author says, her name is Eve Tushnet, she's brilliant, and she says, you can't have a vocation of no. You can't just spend your entire life saying no, but you need something to say yes to. And so the vocational questions have to do with, how am I particularly called to live? If I need to say no in certain ways, if I've given up certain things, if, for instance, I'm not going to have the wife and picket fence and 2.4 children that I was told I needed in order to pursue American happiness, if I say no to that, then what is the vocation that I have instead? What is the thing that I'm called to say yes to? And so I think it's important for all of us, but again, especially important for LGBTQ people in this conversation to ask, how has God perhaps been purposeful in placing you where you are in the world with the kind of giftings that you have, with the kind of experiences of sexuality that you have, and what might be the yeses that God is offering to you? Is there a way, for instance, that a call to celibacy might be God's way of equipping you for a kind of life and access to ministry that wouldn't be available to you if you were married? In the case of some of my LGBTQ or same-sex attracted friends, they've actually felt themselves called into what they would call mixed orientation marriages. And this is a marriage where at least one person in the marriage, it's an opposite sex marriage, but at least one person in the marriage is not attracted to people of the opposite sex by and large. And so, for instance, one of my gay male friends who is in a mixed orientation marriage will say, I have a one-woman orientation. In other words, he says, my wife is the only woman I've ever been attracted to. He is still oriented toward the same sex in general, but he felt God calling him into that marriage, and that marriage has been a gift. Another one of my friends in one of these mixed orientation marriages, her name is Lori Krieg, and she's actually been doing some study on these kinds of marriages. And she said, what we found in our study is that these are often either the weakest marriages or the strongest marriages. They're the weakest if people entered into them thinking, oh, yes, God is going to fix me, he's going to make me straight, and this is how. If they went into it with an expectation that then wasn't met, then they tend to be really weak marriages. But she said, we also interviewed some people in our study who went into a mixed orientation marriage with a clear sense of calling from God, and they said up front, this is going to be hard, we're going to need to communicate, sex may not come super naturally to us, we're going to have to work at making this marriage work, but we're doing it out of obedience to God to honor God. And remarkably, those of you who are married may know this. I actually hear from my straight friends that marriage can also be hard for them. And sometimes sex doesn't always feel like it comes naturally to them. And marriage is a thing that they need to work at. And so sometimes people who enter into mixed orientation marriages have this gift of being set up from the very beginning of their marriage to say, we can only do this in obedience to Christ. We can only do this by the grace of God. There's a kind of weirdness that comes in a mixed orientation marriage. And there's a kind of weirdness that comes with being celibate in a 21st century Western world where so much of the world seems to be all about your happiness, all about your fulfillment. And either way, I think that weirdness can be a gift in the world. That weirdness can be an invitation to say to the people around you, yeah, it's remarkable that I can actually find a sense of vocation, a sense of joy and calling in this. It may not make sense to you, but if it doesn't make sense to you, let me tell you about Jesus, because Jesus is the reason that it makes sense to me. There is a loss that comes for any of us who follow Jesus, for any of us who are called to say no to anything, and all of us are called to say no to something. There's a loss, but there's also a gift that comes with it. There's a saying yes that comes along with the saying no. And then finally, there are corrective questions to be asked here. And corrective questions are questions like, what have I maybe been told I need to give up in order to follow Jesus that Jesus never asked me to abandon? So a couple quick examples here. One, and all of these are the ones that I've experienced in my own life. When I first began to think about celibacy, the assumption that I made about celibacy was, oh, this means I will spend my life alone. I will never have deep, intimate, emotional relationship with people. I will live alone. I will not be involved in the lives of children in any particularly meaningful way. It will mean that I'm condemned to kind of a life of solitude. And as I have worked through with Jesus the question of what does it look like to follow you in a whole and healthy way, I've begun to realize that may be my culture's vision of singleness a lot of the time, but that is not Jesus' vision of singleness for me. That actually there's so much family that Jesus wants to invite me into within the body of Christ that I am called to say yes to. And so I'm not just supposed to withdraw into my own little bubble, but I'm actually invited to lean into deep relationship with people, not in spite of, but precisely because of my celibacy. Another question I had as I was wrestling through what it would look like to follow Jesus, I had assumed that if I followed Jesus, if I was celibate, that maybe that meant that I was just supposed to pretend that I was straight for my entire life, that I absolutely had to keep my experience of sexuality a secret, and that I needed to act like I was just like everyone else, and I just happened to feel like being single. But again, as I wrestled with God and said, what does it look like to live with integrity in the world? That was another place where God said, no, you've assumed that this is what it would look like to follow me in obedience. But actually, the obedience I'm calling you to is something else. Whenever we get in the mode of figuring out what we're saying no to, it's important that we not accept someone else's narrative about things that we need to say no to that maybe God has never called us to say no to. And then lastly, and this is where I'll leave us, and then we can go into just some time of conversation on this question of will it be worth it? One of my favorite moments in the entire Bible is this moment in it's in all three of the Synoptic Gospels because it's just so good. It's in Matthew 19 and Mark 10 and Luke 18, and it's this moment where Peter has just said, and Peter being the mouthy disciple, if anybody's thinking it, Peter saying it, Peter has said to Jesus, Jesus, we left everything to follow you. And the way that Jesus responds to Peter is he says, truly I tell you, there is no one who has left home or fathers or mothers or sisters or brothers or wives or children or fields, who will not fail to receive 100 times as much in this life and in the age to come, eternal life. And I love what Jesus said, because what Jesus doesn't say to Peter is, Peter, you idiot, you didn't give up a thing, quit whining and go stand by Thaddeus. Jesus recognizes that there is real loss, that something is given up in following him, that to be his disciple costs something. And yet what Jesus promises is 100-fold the things that we lose. And especially meaningful for me, 100-fold the family that we think we lost in order to be his disciple. And so I think for me, as I have leaned into this question of what does it look like for me to be obedient to Jesus in the context of my sexuality, it's been really, really important to ask, what are the promises that Jesus makes to me? What does it look like for me to follow him? And is it possible that maybe I'm not just called to suffer through my miserable, lonely existence on earth and then I'll die and things will be better later? But is it possible that there's actually a kind of joy that Jesus wants to give me specifically and you specifically and the person that I am discipling specifically, even as we say no to the things that we thought we needed in order to be happy? Is it possible that Jesus wants to say, no, I actually have a kind of joy, a kind of intimacy, a kind of family that's so much better for you than anything that you could have earned for yourself in this life? And it's not just in the next life, but it's right now, and it's 100-fold what you thought you would lose. I think that is the place where, as we ask the question of what does it look like for the good news to stay good, I think that's the place where I most often need to land, both with myself and with others, is to land in the place of saying, yes, Jesus is who he says he is. Yes, we give things up. But if he really is who he says he is, then his promises are really going to be true. And it really is going to be so, so worth it to follow him. So on that note, I just want to open it up to conversation. Well, I'll turn it back to Fiel, and I'll let Fiel take it from here.
Wow. Thank you, Greg. Oh my goodness. I hope all of you were busy, not paying attention in the sense that you were so busy writing things down, because there was just so much fire, tons of tweetable things. I hope your pens were flying. And so we're going to take this opportunity right now for a 2-minute stretch break because our butts hurt from Zoom. Amen. We have all been exhausted. So why don't you do that? But in the meanwhile, I'm going to ask you to do a wonderful thing for us, which is to find us on Instagram and Facebook. I'm going to drop our handles in the search box, in the chat box down below. So feel free to go up, stretch, get some pee, whatever you want to do. And you can find us on Instagram and Facebook here. So the first one is City Mission NYC, and the second one is Building Blocks by City Mission. Building Blocks is specifically our sessions that we have with these incredible people that have such, how do you say, it's just a view of the gospel that is just so refreshing. So go ahead and take your, all right. And no rush to run back, everybody, because we're just going to do a little bit of celebrating because it's Craig's birthday. So happy birthday, Craig. I don't know if you guys want to sing. I know I feel comfortable with people singing, but happy birthday, Craig. Thank you so much for what you do. And if it's anyone else's birthday or nearby, happy birthday to you as well. In the meanwhile, I wanted to share 3 interesting facts about Greg that he was so kind to send to us, which is 1, he used to work at a bakery and once made 301 pounds of buttercream icing in a single day. I don't know what that means because I have never made buttercream. I don't even know what it is, actually. And another fact number 2 is I used to shave only on Thursdays, but during the pandemic, I've switched to Tuesdays. You're so random, Greg. And 3 is I have a hereditary neurological disorder that makes my hands shake. I hope all of you have interesting facts because each and every one of you is unique. You guys know that. I'm not just trying to throw nice and fuzzy things. But the truth is, they're true. That's probably the best part. So with that, we had one question before I open it up to the Q&R, which is, could you say the line again of not saying no the rest of your life and finding the yes because this person would like to write it down?
Yeah, well, let's see. The specific line, I mean, Eve Tushnet is the author who I quoted, who says, you can't have a vocation of no. But whatever else I said, that you can't spend your entire life saying no. Precisely what you said. You can't spend your entire life saying no, but that you need to have something to say yes to. I'll add to that that God doesn't call us to no's for the sake of saying no, but God calls us to say no in order that we can say yes to something even better.
That's beautiful. Thank you to everyone who followed us on Facebook and Instagram as well. Of course, that is important. And that's how you keep updated with other things that we'll have at City Mission and or Building Blocks. So now I want to open it up to question and response time. We call it Q&R, not because we're hipster, but because we don't always have the answer, but we can always respond to something that you have to say. So you can either text the questions in the chat or just open up your video and ask them directly to Greg, to Greg or me in terms of chatting the questions. So take it away. The floor is open. Well, in that case, I will ask some questions that you guys have asked through the forum. And one of them is, in the same way as anti-racism is different than not a racist, if I'm not anti-gay, then is being an ally sufficient? And what do you think we can do as LGBTQ allies?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll note first of all that the word ally itself has kind of a broad range of meaning, and so depending on who you're talking to, somebody who holds the sexual ethic that I hold with regard to same-sex sexuality, and perhaps an ethic that some of you are also convinced of. It may not be possible for us to be an ally, depending on how that term is conceived of. Because for some people, affirming that followers of Jesus can indeed be called into same-sex sexual relationships must be part of being an ally. But for other people, the word gets defined differently depending on the sort of support that a person feels that they most need. And so the question of how important Christian sexual ethics are to someone's conception of ally probably depends on that person's relationship to Christianity. So if somebody identifies as LGBTQ and Christian and is on the open and affirming end of the sexual ethics question, they're likely to say, no, it's impossible for you to be an ally to me unless you agree with me that I can be in a same-sex sexual relationship and also be following Jesus. But when I talk with LGBTQ friends who are either not part of the church or who are part of the church and have a more traditional sexual ethic, when I talk to folks outside the church, usually their interest in the particular questions of what I think someone who follows Jesus might be called to do to steward their sexuality in obedience to Jesus, that's not super high on their priority list. The things that they care about are usually things like we want to see people who are against LGBTQ bullying in schools. We want to see people who are fighting to stop acts of violence against LGBTQ people, and especially against trans people. We want to see people who are doing something concrete to help LGBTQ homeless youth. There was a time when the question of the legalization of same-sex marriage was also on that list. We want people who are advocating for us with regard to the legality of same-sex marriage. And I'll note, regardless of where you land on the political spectrum, I think it's possible to land on either end of the political spectrum while holding a historic sexual ethic, because followers of Jesus don't necessarily need to be legislating that everyone who lives in the nation they live in is behaving in the way that they believe other followers of Jesus ought to behave. So in other words, the fact that I now live in a nation where the Supreme Court has declared, yes, people can be in same-sex marriages, that doesn't inhibit me from following Jesus. Whether or not I think that that's a good thing, I think at this point, we can say the Supreme Court has decided that question is done. We no longer need to debate whether or not same-sex marriage, civil marriage, should be legal. But we can continue to ask the question, what does it look like to support people who are LGBTQ in the ways that they need to be supported? And so again, I think for a lot of people that has to do with things like homelessness, with things like bullying. But I think most significantly, on a personal level, being an ally means being the sort of person who recognizes the specific needs in a person's life and wants to help meet them. So whether that means being present for a friend who is being rejected by their family because of disagreements around sexuality, it's possible that you may not agree with everything an LGBTQ friend chooses to do, but you can still be the sort of person who says, you're always safe to come to me, you're always safe to be with me. Regardless of any difference of opinion that we might have, I want to be the sort of person who helps meet any material needs that you have, and I want to be the sort of person who is a shoulder that you can cry on when you need to mourn things that are hard. So I think those can all be components of being an ally. But again, I would be careful not to try to apply the word ally to yourself, both because it gets defined a lot of ways, and because I think ultimately, regardless of whether the conversation you're having is about sexuality or about race or about any number of things, ally is not a term that those of us on the outside can claim for ourselves. I can't look at the conversation about race and claim I am an ally to people of color. What I can do is do my best to live like I think an ally to people of color ought to live. And then hopefully those people can look at the way that I live, at the way that I love them, and say, ah, yes, Coles, he was an ally to me.
Wow. Man, we're getting really good questions in, and I'm just trying to organize the ones that I have thrown at you.
While you're organizing, could I ask a question?
Go ahead, Judy.
I have a very good friend who is in the ministry and has always felt a same-sex attraction and also felt that he needed to be celibate. Mm. But in recent years, he found someone, and he's still a priest in an Episcopal church, I believe. And he's married now, and I just would like your viewpoint. When I talk to him, do I need to let him know that I don't agree biblically, and still show him love, or should I just let that go and just show him that I want to be his friend, and I've just kind of turned a blind eye, and that's not right.
Yeah. Thanks for that question, Judy. That's such an important question. How we navigate those relationships in a way that points people to Jesus. I would say, I think the priority in all of our relationships needs to be to point people toward Jesus more. So for instance, Judy, let's imagine that you were friends with me. You seem like the sort of person I'd want to be friends with, so I like this imagination already. Let's imagine that you were friends with me, even though you and I are on the same page about sexual ethics. I trust once you get to know me, you would probably begin to realize, like, oh, there are still some ways in which Coles needs to grow in his faith. Like, he has not arrived with Jesus quite yet. And so I hope I hope that that the way that you are in relationship with me would continue nudging me in the direction of Jesus. But I don't think, especially in cases where we have a difference of understanding about what the best is that God is calling us to, I don't see there being a whole lot of productivity in us continually harping on the same things. I have a dear friend who's a Calvinist, and I don't mean to get us into the Calvinist-Arminian debate, but let's just say he's very Calvinist, I am less Calvinist, and he and I will sometimes discuss it. We know that the other thinks differently about that theological question, but it's important that our relationship is not about every time we get together being like, hey, just FYI, you're still wrong about Calvinism. In the same way that I would say, Judy, it doesn't seem to me like it would do much productively to have you feel like, oh, when I get together with this friend, I need to be like, hey, have you read Romans 1 recently? I think in the context of good, deep relationship, I think it's appropriate that we come to understand places where we think differently. And especially as people are inviting our feedback to say, yeah, I do wonder if maybe Jesus might call you to something differently than he seems to be calling you right now. But I think our bigger priority is to keep saying to everyone in our lives, regardless of how similar or how different they are from us, to keep saying like, hey, this guy Jesus, I still think he's going to wreck your life. I think he's going to wreck my life. I think he's going to call us both to more things than we dared to think he might possibly call us to. And whether or not that results in a particular friend ever changing in one way or another, I think the invitation of people toward Jesus, ever further toward Jesus, is always going to be a good invitation.
Wow. That answered another question that somebody else had, which was, how do you evangelize to a gay person? So I guess we'll skip over that. But of course, you can go back to it later. The next question that I would throw at you is, it was asked by two different people using similar words, which is, can you be in a gay relationship without having sex? Or do you think people can be called to live in same-sex marriage and remain celibate?
Yeah. So this is among the celibate gay crowd, if you will, which is it's already kind of a small enough crowd. I mean, there's plenty of us, but it's a fairly niche group. And yet there are so many sort of subdivisions of thought within that already fairly small group. And this is one of the ongoing conversations that's being had. Is there such a thing as a celibate partnership, or being in relationship and yet being in celibate relationship with each other? What's the wisdom of that? Is it allowed? Is it good? And I would say this. Let me without sort of landing too tidily, let me offer like things that I think pull us in two directions. The one is, and let me speak personally for myself for a moment. If I had a dear friend, and I have had some dear friends over the course of time who have been like, oh, wow, I definitely have a crush on you. It's also possible that you can have a crush on me. It would be very tempting for us to want to call each other boyfriend right now. If I were to say, yeah, I'm going to do that relationship. We're going to call each other boyfriends, and we're just going to say, but we're not having sex. I think for me personally, that would put me again and again in kinds of situations. It would cause me to replay dialogues in my head that would make it increasingly difficult for me to live by the sexual ethic that I hold to be true. And so, well, I don't know that there's a sort of a categorical, clear biblical rule against it. I don't think that it would be wise for me to do that. So that's one thought. On the other hand, I think it's helpful to note that that the conception that we have of romance right now in the 21st century tends to include a whole ton of things, and it seems to say this whole ton of things only belongs to a certain kind of relationship. Right? You should only ever spend one-on-one time gazing into each other's eyes. You should only ever have a candlelight dinner. You should only ever give each other flowers. You should only ever cuddle on a couch. You should only ever, I don't know, a whole ton of things. You should only ever say, this is a person who I'm spending the rest of my life with, and we will always move to the same cities. I would rather be with you than find a better job in a different city. I would rather reorder my life so that we are always together. These are all things that in the 21st century, we tend to take and say, this is romance. But I wonder if we've cast the net of romance a little too broadly, and then we've tried to make a marriage or a romantic relationship be a whole bunch of things that it was never meant to be, that it wasn't meant to carry the burden of all that. Because we see, for instance, let's talk about David and Jonathan for a moment. There's this wonderful moment where David and Jonathan are talking, and David says to Jonathan, your love for me was more excellent than the love of women. Which, if that's not a romantic line, I don't know what is. If their sort of lifelong commitment to each other is not a kind of intense, I don't know what you want to call it in 21st century terms. But there does seem to be a biblical category for commitment, the kind of commitment that that Ruth has for Naomi, where she says, where you go, I'm going, your people, my people, we're in this thing together. There is this sort of same-sex commitment that I think if we saw it in the 21st century, a lot of people would look at it and say, oh yeah, they're obviously dating. Yep, they're in a relationship. Oh, that's probably a celibate partnership. Because what else could it be? Because the only category that we usually have for people who are committed to each other in that kind of relationship is people who are also in bed together. And so maybe there is a value in us sort of breaking apart some of the categories and saying maybe there's opportunity to pursue kinds of being together, kinds of commitment to one another that don't need to belong exclusively in the thing that we call romance. So I find myself sort of holding those two things in tension, saying, I don't want to say no to good, deep connection with people just because society would think it's weird or would think that I'm acting gay in relationship with another person. But I also don't want to unwisely move my heart in the direction of behaving like I'm in a marriage with everything but the sex. And then eventually I feel like, as long as we're doing everything but the sex, why not just throw the sex in there too? There are also fascinating legal questions, I think, to be asked. For instance, I've known some couples who were in civil marriages to each other, same-sex couples, in some cases had kids, and then both came to a conviction that they were called to be celibate, that they were no longer called to be in a sexual relationship with each other. But that raised all kinds of questions. What do we do with our kids? What do we do with the fact that one of us is reliant on the other one's health care and needs that health care in order to continue to have the medical care that they need? What do we do with all these kinds of questions? And I think whatever you want to say about what we do with those questions, there are definitely concrete needs that I think as we as the church have conversations with people about what it's going to look like for them to be obedient, I think we shouldn't be too quick to impose our comfort level onto other people, to say, look, the fact that you guys are still living in the same household, that just makes me uncomfortable, so you got to stop. Maybe Jesus is calling them to move out. Maybe Jesus is saying, part of your obedience may be moving into separate households. But I don't think that's for you to say. I think that is for Jesus to say to them. And I think your job as a supporting person is to say, if you think Jesus is calling you to move out, how can the church help meet the needs that we know are going to arise as a result? We know this might be costly. How can we come alongside you and help be the family that you need?
Wonderful. Man, thank you so much. There are other questions that I'm going to throw at you, and this is a chicken or the egg question that you've heard millions of times, which is, what are your thoughts on the idea that you were born gay versus being gay as an outcome of your environment? And if you were born gay, why would God create someone this way, knowing they are not able to pursue those they love? Have fun.
Love it. Okay. So a few thoughts here. First of all, as to the science of the matter, to what degree is sexuality sort of determined prenatally, and to what degree is it influenced by things after birth? the best science I've read seems sort of mixed on the matter, that there are both some genetic factors and some environmental factors at play. And personally, I don't have a hugely invested dog in that fight. It's neither one is necessarily a shock to me. The idea that maybe my environment played some role in causing me to have an experience of sexuality that I do, sure. But the possibility that I might be born, that even before birth, I might already have had a proclivity for certain kinds of things that God might call me to say no to, that also doesn't shock me, because that I think is the state of humankind. That all of us are born with a proclivity to so many things that if we choose to follow Jesus, we're going to be called to say no to it. And in fact, when I'm thinking about sexuality, I think that's equally true of straight sexuality and of gay sexuality. That both kinds of sexuality, and I don't want to suggest that those two binaries are the only options, certainly. But if we accept those as two sort of poles here in the current conversation, neither one of those things is the way that God designed us originally, per se. Because now, speaking as a non-straight person here, don't let me tell you what it's like for those of you who identify as straight. But here's my understanding, is that if you're straight, you don't always only exclusively experience sexual desire for the one person that you're married to. Being straight comes with a variety of temptations, of things that must be said no to in obedience to Jesus. And being straight also comes with ways in which you have the opportunity to steward your sexuality, to say yes to Jesus. The same is true of me as a gay person, that there are ways in which I'm called to say no, that there are ways in which I'm called to say yes. So when I think about God's intention, did God make me gay? I don't want to blame him for the fact that I experienced temptation. The book of James says, "Let no one say when he's tempted, God is tempting me." So I don't think it's God's fault that I am tempted. But I also don't think that that my sexuality is somehow fallen in a way that straight sexuality is not. I think that all forms of sexuality, straight and gay and everything else, are all by definition post-lapsarian. That is, they're a kind of sexuality that can only occur after the fall of humankind, that they reflect the fact that we are in some ways broken, that we're not the original perfect thing that God designed us to be. But I only want to acknowledge that while also simultaneously acknowledging that we also, all of us, gay and straight and everything else, we all also bear the fingerprints of a God who put us together and said in the moment he created us, well, hot dang, that is very good. And so there's a particular kind of goodness, I think, that God has in mind for each one of us. There's a particular kind of yes. And when I think about why did God allow me to have this particular fallen experience of sexuality instead of a different fallen experience of sexuality, the thing that I find myself returning to is the thought that God had a particular kind of yes that he wanted me to say. And my conviction is that for me, that yes involves celibacy, that yes involves a certain kind of affection that I can enjoy for the same sex, not a sexual affection, but a deep friendship that I find comes really easy to me in ways that it doesn't always seem to come as easily to my straight brothers in Christ. Who sometimes their friendships with other men seem to be sort of like basically bravado and like, like there's a kind of like a natural drawing toward intimate relationship that comes easy to me. And I can embrace that yes. I can embrace the yes of loving people broadly as a single person. And to me, that's the place where I would credit God with the intentionality that he's given with regard to my sexuality. Not that I'm blaming him for the ways that I experience temptation, but that I'm actually thanking him for the particular ways that I get to say yes.
That's great. Thank you. Great for those answers. So, for everyone listening, I don't know if you guys know Sam Alberry. He's an Anglican priest and works with RZIM, Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. And I had the pleasure of sitting in a class with him through one of Tim Keller's classes in Manhattan. And he was talking about just basically the same talk in terms of information. And one of the things he said that I never forgot, which Greg has already said, is that the truth is no one is straight. We are all sexually immoral. We just happen to do it differently. And so that just lines up with everything that Greg has said earlier, that if we think in terms of like, oh, straight versus gay, like, no, you have to remember that you as a straight person or anything else, we all have that sin nature. I want to ask if anybody wants to throw a question at Greg, if you want to throw on your video or something like that, before I throw in the last question. Yeah, it is a tough topic. I know there's a lot of anonymous requests. So I'll ask one more question before we pull it to a close. And how does the church not condone the sin, but also accept the sinner? And can you comment on the diversity of views of sexuality within the church? And can people of this different views still coexist within the same church or community? And how does that work?
Okay. Let me break apart the pieces here and see. So first of all, with regard to the question of like loving the sinner and hating the sin, I'll say up front, that's not a phrase I'm hugely enthusiastic about. In part because it seems to particularly identify the other person as the sinner. Instead of identifying all of us collectively as people who all experience fallen nature, people who all fall into sin, people who all need constant, ongoing, repeated forgiveness. And it seems to me that when the Bible talks about our sinfulness, the posture that it encourages us to have is the posture that Paul takes in Romans, which is to say, Christ came to save sinners, of whom I am the worst. I think the category of sin is meant to turn us inward first, to have us look at our own hearts and to see sinfulness there, not to turn us outward and to say, let me find someone who sins differently than I do, and let me point out the fact that they are a sinner. So I would say, I would rather say, how do we love all people, even as we and the people that we love all sometimes struggle to live up to the ethics that we hold, or as we perhaps hold different views about ethics, and so we live in ways that we don't think are in obedience to Jesus. But within that posture, because I think the heart behind wanting to love people, even though we don't always agree with everything that they do, I think that's absolutely at the heart of the conversation that we want to have. And I think part of that means, again, some of the things that we've already talked about, things like attending to material needs, even if we don't agree with everything about the way a person lives their life, asking, how can I concretely help to meet your needs? I think it means, like we were talking about with Judy's friend earlier, I think it means pursuing relationship without making agreement or disagreement on a specific ethical question be the dividing line. Look, we can only be friends if you either start behaving the way I want you to behave with regard to sexuality, or with the understanding that every time I see you, the first thing I'll ask you is like, hey, are you still gay? Because I've heard about this ministry that could make you less gay in the future. It means prioritizing relationship, prioritizing pointing people to Jesus, rather than getting stuck on the places where we disagree. But moving to the sort of the second component of that question, which is the positive, to what degree can we coexist even within the same church? There are two different models, I think, that we want to consider here for that. One is churches that have a clear stance on a theological question like sexual ethics, but who say people are invited to be part of this family even if they disagree with our stance. So that, for instance, is the way that the church I'm in right now operates. We are a church that's part of a group that says, hey, we do have a collective understanding of what marriage means biblically for followers of Jesus, and we understand sex to be exclusively designed to exist within that marriage covenant between male and female, and certainly LGBTQ people can equally hold to and abide by that sexual ethic, because here I am celibate, I lead worship at my church. I'm in agreement with the church. We also do have a few folks in our congregation who would say, I actually don't agree with that statement about sexual ethics. Whether it's straight people who just have a more progressive sexual ethics, or whether it is LGBTQ people themselves, we do have some of those folks in our congregation, and they know that they're welcome. They're welcome to participate in things. But the way that my church handles that is that there's a certain level of leadership roles, that certain kinds of teaching in leadership, especially teaching around that specific question, can only be done by people who agree with that ethical stance. Now, that's not uncommon. For instance, I'm at a church that doesn't have women serving in all roles of leadership. I happen to be someone who thinks that women should be biblically equipped to serve in all roles of church leadership. So I will probably never be a pastor at my church. I think worship leader is about as high as I go before I'm going to have to switch denominations or do something else. But I understand that has to do with the difference that we have theologically. I'm still welcome to be part of the group, but we do have an understanding of the difference that we have. There are also some churches, often called third way churches, that will have sort of a purposefully undecided stance on the question of sexual ethics. And so they'll just say, we try to be broad enough to include people who think both ways or more than both ways on this question of sexual ethics. In my experience of those churches, I've had just a bit of interaction with some folks in those congregations. I think there can be some really beautiful things that come out of that with regard to their desire to see unity. I do, however, have some concerns that it seems like those churches end up coming kind of de facto one or the other. Like, here's a church where we say we don't have a stance, but everyone on leadership mostly happens to be either one or the other. And our church has to make certain policies like, can our facilities be used to perform same-sex marriages? There are questions just about the ongoing life of the church that need to be answered in some way. And so often the attempt to avoid the question doesn't really avoid it. It just causes an answer to become assumed instead of stated directly. Personally, I tend to prefer, hey, let's state things directly. If we disagree, let's admit that we disagree and figure out how to continue on in relationship. So that would be my inclination. But I recognize that people have tried it different ways.
That's great. Thank you, Greg. Oh my goodness, man, just so much to absorb. And in fact, for those of you that want more information and want to understand more of where he's coming from, well, first of all, I want to thank all of you for your questions. And second, thank you so much for not attacking him, which, speakers tend to get attacked, especially on tough issues. But this shows today, this is proof that you at your church have issues that everyone is asking questions about, and they're not getting answers. And so I pray that wherever you go, wherever you are, that you will constantly spur discussion, not in a way to fight, but also invite those to that can speak to these issues. Like Greg, you can definitely get in touch with him. So I'm going to drop in the link for his book, Single Gay Christian, right now. But also on top of that, I'm sure you're asking questions like, who are some other people you can recommend? Because Greg is not the only guy that has written or speaks about this at all. In fact, there are women that are very prominent that talk about this, with whom that Greg has spoken with. So, Greg, if you could share some people that you know that you are friends with or not to discuss this, that'd be great.
Yeah, for sure. So some great other voices. Rachel Gilson has a book that just came out. She works with Krieg, the college student organization. That's a terrific book. Lori Krieg, who I mentioned earlier, has an organization called Hole in My Heart Ministries. They do a podcast. She and her husband, Matt, are writing a book that I believe comes out in November with IVP, InterVarsity Press. I mean, there are so many more. There's an organization called the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, which is an organization I've done a fair bit of work with. And they kind of collect a whole ton of resources in this conversation. If you have specific questions or anything that you want to follow up on, I would say feel free to get in touch with me. A couple easy ways to do that. I mean, you can read my book, of course, which if you do, I hope you find it worthwhile. But you can go to my website, gregorycoles.com or gregcoles.com. And if you want to get in touch with me, just use that contact form. It'll just send me an email. I'm also on Facebook. Those are easy ways to find me. Or you can write Fiel and be like, yo, Fiel, I need to get in touch with Greg, and I'll make sure that Fiel has like an email address he can give you. But I'd be glad to point you to any other specific resources or to answer questions that you have. It would be my honor, and I appreciate you guys joining us.
Wow! So you answered two questions off the bat. You know, the second one was like, where can people find you and get in touch with you? So yeah, just head over to gregcoles.com and take a look at his book. For some of you might be like, why did you send the Amazon link? You can order anywhere. You can order it directly through IVP Press or whatever. But thank you so much. Keep your emails open because we will be sending a recording of this talk to you, which will be uploaded to YouTube as well, including links and anything else that you may get in touch with us at City Mission. We're here for you. We're looking forward to the next one. No promises on what the topic will be, but considering the climate, you probably got a sense of what it will be discussing in the next session. So with that, thank you so much everyone for being here. You guys are awesome. And Greg, I guess, would it be okay if you close us out in prayer?
Oh, I'd love to. God, I thank you. I thank you for the body of Christ. I thank you that those who follow you are a family that transcends location, that we can be gathered from around the nation, around the world even. I thank you that your kingdom transcends race, that it brings together people of different experiences of sexuality. And I thank you that your gospel is good news for each one of us. And so I ask God that this time together would be just the beginning of many more good conversations, that it would be the beginning of people being able to reach out to folks in their own communities. God, I pray that the goodness of your good news would continue to be spread, that people would encounter you as you truly are, that they would be drawn into a desire to follow you, that they would experience the joy that comes with following you. I ask that you would make us disciples who shine your love, your affection, that you would make us lights in the world. We thank you for this time together. We thank you in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen.
Thank you so much to Greg, and thank you so much to everyone for being here. You guys are so brave. We hope that you continue the conversations wherever you are with whoever you're with, not in a way that causes strife. As the wonderful Bob Goff told me once in a phone call, he said, you don't have to swing at every pitch. And so that's my hope for you, that you'll take this home. And thank you so much. We're looking forward to getting in touch and sending you all the resources you need. So